Hi, I'm Grace, and this is every book that I read in 2024. I loved it. Prove me wrong. Go ahead. Truly vile. That does not excuse the fact that you wrote the crazy line to begin with. The worst possible thing that could have happened. I love watching other people make these videos and talk about books for a long time, so I thought, why not make my own this year? I read a lot of literary fiction and books about women, so if you're not into that, you probably won't like most of these books. But I mix in a little bit of other stuff, but that's the main thing that I read. I'm gonna talk about them in the order that I read them, not in like the order that I liked them or anything like that. And just as a disclaimer, I am very nitpicky about books and very particular about what I like. So just because I say that I didn't like a book in this video doesn't mean that it was a bad book or that you won't like it. It's just not for me, and that's okay. The first book that I read this year was Happy Hour by Marlowe Granados. It is about two girls who immigrate to New York City and they don't have work visas, so they end up like kind of selling clothes during the day and doing odd jobs for money. And then at night, they like live it up and go out to bars and like spend a lot of time with men who will pay their tabs because they have no money. It's written as a diary by one of the girls, and just kind of like the ultimate two girls just hanging out book, which I do enjoy. It reminds me a little bit of Broad City, but kind of more serious tone than that. My favorite part was one of them actually goes to the beach. I think it was Long Island, if I remember correctly, with a bunch of like rich acquaintances, and the way that they treat her is like almost surreal, like the differences between classes and trying to socialize, which I think is a very interesting topic to read about, how that can affect a relationship. So I enjoyed this book. It's a fun read, I would say. Maybe you would like it. The next book I read, just let me explain. I actually read Eat, Pray, Love by Elizabeth Gilbert, which I know some people really don't like. I read it specifically because my boyfriend read it in college and hated it, so I wanted to know if his hatred was justified, and I do think that it was. If you don't know, it's a memoir by Elizabeth Gilbert, and it takes place shortly after she divorces her husband, and it tells the story of her embarking on a journey of personal discovery through Italy, India, and Indonesia, in that order. And so in the beginning, she was just like wandering around Rome and eating pasta, and I was like, I can get down with this. Like, I get that. That's awesome. But then the other parts of the book, it started to get kind of like preachy, and it read a little bit like she was kind of appropriating different cultures, and I don't know, it was a little bit off. And then I also really didn't like that she went on this whole journey, like, to find herself after leaving a man. And she talks about how she wants to decenter men from her life, and she wants this whole journey, she wants to be celibate. But then multiple times throughout the book, she becomes obsessed with, like, different men that she meets, which kind of defeats the purpose. And I know it's her real life, so, like, that's what really happened. She can't change it, but I don't know. Didn't make for a great book. Another point is that she talks about how she goes on this whole journey because her publisher gave her an advance on writing the book about this, like writing this exact book. So it's also like kind of knowing that she has this like situation and this opportunity to go on this like self-discovery journey because she is already kind of a prominent writer who is able to just be given money on the promise that she will get around to writing a book about it. And then I kind of have like a semi-related topic that this brought up for me that I was thinking about. Kind of like, do you think that there can be a difference ever between traveling to learn about new regions and cultures and stuff like that versus being a tourist and kind of exploiting locals as a foreigner, like in their area? I know it's kind of a heavily debated topic. There's probably not a right answer, or maybe there is. If you have an opinion on it, let me know. Next up, I read Sorrow and Bliss by Meg Mason. This is definitely a sad girl book, if you're into that. It is set in the UK, and it is about a woman who is struggling a lot with her mental health. She's very depressed, and she's also struggling a lot with the idea of motherhood. She's married, but she doesn't have any children, and throughout the book, her sister has children, so that's kind of her relation to it. She's driving a lot of people away from her due to her mental health problems, most notably her husband. It includes a lot of flashbacks to her childhood, kind of talking about how she was raised and how her relationship with her husband has changed over time because they met very young. The ending of the book includes like an explanation slash like diagnosis for her mental health, which for her was like enlightening and helpful. Obviously that's not how it is for everybody, but without spoiling it, the explanation just took me out of the book. Like, you'll know what I mean if you've read this or when you read it. I get that it served a purpose, but I didn't like it. I thought it was, it removed me from the story, but maybe you could get over that. Who knows? The next book, I have to give another disclaimer for. I promise not all of the books have disclaimers about why I read them. I just had, at the front end of my year, I was reading a lot based on other people. For a book club my friend started, I read 50 Shades of Grey by E.L. James. This was actually the first book that the book club read, kind of a weird start, but I'll keep it brief. You already know what this book is about. The part that I hated the most was how the main character was always referencing her inner goddess. What is that? What is an inner goddess? What does that mean? We never get an answer, and I was lost the whole time. Another thing to think about if you're thinking of reading this for a book club, which you probably aren't, is that you should probably read it with people that you know well. I didn't know a lot of the people in this book club very well, and most of a book club for 50 Shades involves talking about whether or not you think the things they are doing is normal or not. So be prepared to discuss that with your acquaintances and or friends. After that one, I read Gentlemen Prefer Blondes by Anita Loos, and this is just a romp. It's great. I read it in one day. It's pretty short, and it's about two friends who spend most of their time playing tricks on men, usually like to steal from them or something like that. Everybody in the book is objectively a bad person, but I was surprised that the plot and like the tricks that they're pulling actually did surprise me as much as they did. This is also a play and a movie. I haven't seen either of them, but I can imagine that it translated really well, like to a format like that. I think I read this off of Uncarly's recommendation here on YouTube. She has a lot of great recommendations for like lesser known women's fiction, literary fiction. She's awesome. Next, I read Evidence of the Affair by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I've read a few of her books before, and I kind of have the same opinion of all of them. I think that the form that she uses is very creative and interesting, but I think that the stories themselves are so predictable that they become boring, which is what I thought about this one and the other books of hers that I've read so far. I did love Daisy Jones and the Six, but that's just because I'm biased and I love classic rock, so any book written about it is like automatically more interesting to me. But this was not about classic rock, so it suffered from being boring. This one is written in the format of letters back and forth between a man and a woman. I'm going to try and explain it without it getting confusing. The woman writes to the man first, and they're strangers, by the way. And she says, I think my husband is sleeping with your wife. Can you please investigate some details at your place and see if you agree and think that they are having an affair? She's right. These people are having an affair, and whatever you think is going to happen with the rest of the book based on that, you're probably right. That's what happens. I enjoyed the format of the letters, and it's also very short. If you're looking for a fun, easy, quick read, this could definitely be it. The next book I read is 5 Tuesdays in Winter by Lily King. This is a collection of short stories by Lily King. She also wrote Writers and Lovers, which I think is probably her most popular book. I have that one here. It looks like this. Most, but I think all of the stories are based in New England, and I live in New England, but I actually read this while I was out of town, so it was a nice little slice of home. And I do really like books that are set in places I've lived before, because then it's so fun to recognize all the places and have your own memories associated with the places that the characters go. If I had to say something bad about this book, it would be that so many of the characters need to learn to keep it in their pants. It's not a sexual book, but 70% of the problems like between characters would be solved if they were all just less horny. So, yeah. After that, I read Paul by Daisy Lafarge. This is about a woman. She's doing that thing where you like work different places around the world for short periods of time in exchange for having a free place to stay. I don't know if there's a more succinct way to explain that or if there's a word for that, but there probably is. She's doing it in France, and unfortunately, she falls in love with one of the hosts that she has, who, of course, is a much older man. She's working on his farm, and she likes him so much that she gives up her other travel plans for the rest of the trip to spend more time with him. She's a very passive character. You know, things kind of happen to her, and she's just like, okay, which it's not necessarily a bad thing to me. Sometimes I can handle it, but sometimes it's like, okay, girl, get up, like, do something. And with this book specifically, it was like watching her fall for the guy was like watching a horror movie where you're like, no, don't do that. It's clearly not going to end well for you. But there's nothing you can do besides watch it happen. That's what this book is. This year I read Chameleon in a Candy Store by Anonymous. This is the sequel to Diary of an Oxygen Thief, which I have over here. Looks like this. If you haven't heard of these before, it's written anonymously, duh, and they are truly vile. It's extremely misogynistic and hateful, and I have a lot of thoughts about this, so strap in for this one, but the narrator becomes very paranoid throughout the book, the first one, and it was written, like, honestly as someone's real diary, but you don't know if it's written, like, you know, actually from the perspective of a real-life misogynist who thinks all of these things and does all of these crazy, terrible things, or if it's written as kind of a satire of that by somebody else who doesn't believe these things, maybe even a woman. There's a lot of theories about who wrote it, but I don't think anybody really knows for sure. I love that idea. I think it's creative, I think it's powerful, I think it really has an opportunity to provide unique takes on different subjects, like men's mental health and the objectification of women, and I did really like the first one. However, with the second one, which is the one I read this year, it's kind of like, it just lost that touch for me. It was much more focused on the narrator's sex life and the luring in of various women, whereas the first book focused on his outside life as well, like his job. He's like an advertising creative executive or something like that. And I thought that the first one came off as like self-aware, and the narrator's getting very paranoid and questioning his own reality, and, you know, he knows that that's happening. But this one, instead, it was kind of like meta instead of self-aware. It references the original book quite a lot and how it, like, the sales are doing and stuff like that, which is interesting, but it's not necessarily, like, compelling for the story. I was willing to buy into the meta-ness of it in a way to, like, enhance the reality of this possibly fake person who's writing these books, but it didn't make me want to pick up the book anymore. And then I tried to read the third book in this series, which is called Eunuchs and Nymphomaniacs, later on this year, but it just trended even more in the direction of, like, objectifying women without any nuance or questioning of that behavior, and I gave up on it. I didn't even finish it. So that is my long-winded review of the entire series. But I only read the second book in this year, 2024. After that, I read Acts of Desperation by Meg Nolan. This is another book where the main character is pretty passive, not as much as the girl in Paul, but still pretty passive. She lives with her boyfriend, who honestly does not seem to like her very much, and he's kind of outright mean to her at times. She spends the book doing everything that she can to kind of win him over, but at best, he's, like, indifferent to her efforts. She's a very anxious, overthinking character, and I did find that very interesting to read. I enjoyed like reading her thoughts when she was really spiraling and obsessing over him and everything that she could do for him and trying to get him to love her in the way that she wanted him to love her. If that concept sounds interesting to you, you'd probably really like this. I recommended it to a friend as well, and she also loved it. But if you prefer more like self-assured characters and a stronger plot where things actually happen, you probably won't care about this, and you might even find it insufferable. To each their own. After that, I read The Secret History by Donna Tartt, and this has been on my list forever. I finally got around to it this year, and I loved it. If you don't know already, this is a classic, I would say, published in the 90s about a group of friends at a college in Vermont who kill someone. That's not a spoiler, it's revealed like immediately. The friends all study classics under this like strange, eccentric professor, and if you want to be in his program, then he teaches all of your classes. You don't have any other professors, just him. It's narrated by a guy who starts out as an outsider, and he wants to join the program and join the friend group. So I thought that was an interesting perspective. I really liked reading his point of view. I love dark academia, which this is, but what I don't love is like magic and wizardry and all of that usually comes with dark academia. I like my books to be extremely realistic. I'm not interested in fantasy or science fiction or anything that's not real. Sorry. So any dark academia novel that doesn't have those is right up my alley. You could also say that this book would fit into like the thriller genre, which is another thing I don't care too much about, but this one really, it did draw me in. I liked it a lot. I thought all of the characters were so interesting and so unique, and I love the setting too. Again, New England, and the writing style is just beautiful. It's amazing. It's poetic. It's great descriptions. It's really, really well written. I didn't love the ending, but I wouldn't say that the ending like ruins the whole book for me or anything like that. I did try to read more of Donna Tartt's books. I started, I think, The Goldfinch, and I just didn't really find it as captivating like at the beginning, so I didn't keep going with it. But I would be willing to give it another shot. So if you read The Secret History and enjoyed it, and you liked it, or you liked, I think her other book is called The Little Friend, or A Little Friend? The Little Friend. If you liked that, let me know. Maybe I'll try it again. After that, I read another recent classic from the 90s, The Virgin Suicides by Eugenides. It's also a movie, which I haven't seen because I don't watch movies, but it's about a family of teenage-ish sisters who all unfortunately take their own lives. And it's told from the perspective of boys who live in their neighborhood and are kind of watching it unfold from across the street. It was a meh book for me. I thought it was an interesting concept, but it's not like overwhelmingly engaging. And I found it to be a little bit more juvenile oriented than I expected it to be. Like, obviously there's suicide in it, so I wouldn't give it to your 12-year-old, but a few years older, I'd say it's definitely like an appropriate level for an older teenager. I have a friend who loves his books, and I didn't hate this one, so I'd be willing to give it another chance. Maybe this just wasn't the right book for me, but I would like other books that he's written. After that, I read Sex and Rage by Eve Babitz. This was my first Eve Babitz book. This one is about a young writer moving between New York and LA, and she's kind of drifting through life. She's supposed to be writing a book. She's not really writing it. She's mostly just partying. It's one of those books that's a little bit plotless. A lot of the times when I read books about this era, it's set like around the 70s, I find them to be like kind of overly pretentious for what they actually are. But Sex and Rage, I thought, was actually refreshingly simple, and I didn't feel like it was preaching to me about how good things used to be or anything like that. It just felt like a real story that happened to be from that time period without any of the pretentious like name dropping or anything like that. Next, I read A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara, and this is another book that was on my list forever that I finally tackled. For some reason, A Little Life and The Secret History are like permanently linked in my brain, even though they don't really have that much to do with each other. I don't know if you have books like that where you always think of them together for basically no reason, but I do. Anyways, this book is focused on a friend group, actually of all men, which is pretty rare for me to read a book that's so focused on men, much less a 700-page book. It's 700 pages, by the way. For it to be so long, it takes place over a very long period of time throughout the lives of this friend group as things change and they grow. It starts with them in college, and I believe they're middle-aged at the end of the book. The book focuses a lot on one of the boys named Jude, who has undergone, no exaggeration, every possible trauma that a person could go through before the age of 20, and some more after age 20 as well. Some of the trauma left him disabled and in severe chronic pain. He's very, very private about it, so his friends don't totally know everything that happened to him. They just know that something happened, at least one thing, that left him disabled before they met. But we don't have a clue about the full extent of it, and neither does the reader at the start. Over the course of the book, it's all very slowly revealed over time. The book focuses a lot on queerness, mental health, physical health, trauma, obviously, and how the dynamics between the friends shift and change a lot over time due to these things. A lot of people have actually criticized the book because they think that it's trauma porn. I can see the argument for that, but I didn't find it to be like that, at least not deliberately. I think it's just a genuine, extremely sad story. My library copy that I got had a blurb on the back of it that called it an epic study of trauma. I feel like that's a bit more of an accurate representation of what it was. My review is, if you've read this, you'll understand that the ending was like the worst possible thing that could have happened. It was so heartbreaking. For me, it was 4 stars because I do think that we could have cut a little bit, not a lot. I think we could get this down to like 650 pages, maybe 600. After a Little Life, I read A Good Happy Girl by Marissa Higgins. This is about a nervous, self-destructive lesbian attorney who prefers to see couples. And it's about her experience with one specific couple who's married. This book is truly objectively gross. I have nothing against books about polyamorous couples or books that talk about sex or queerness or anything like that. I don't mean it's gross like that. I mean the main character herself is very gross. There's a lot of strange, body horror isn't the right word, but discussion about bodies and things that she wants to happen to her body or the couple's bodies that are just genuinely upsetting and a little disgusting. She's very obsessed with being sick. She wants to be sick. She likes to be sick. And she wants the couple to care for her while she's sick. When I was reading this, I did wonder if it's specifically for some kind of fetish that I just didn't get, but I did not like this book. Maybe if you're into gross girl books, because there are a lot of those, if you like that, then maybe you would like this book. Then I read This Is Pleasure by Mary Gaitskill. This was another recommendation from Uncarly, and I loved this. It is very short. It is about a woman whose longtime friend, who's a man, is having a bunch of accusations against him during the Me Too movement. And it's her kind of reflecting on her own experiences with him and how she didn't think of him as a monster, and she still doesn't, even though he is kind of a little more touchy and personal and sexually open than other people might like. And she's not defending him. The book is not her defending him, but she's kind of just thinking to herself about how she wouldn't have made an accusation like this about him, even though she's had some surprising and maybe even questionable interactions with him throughout the years, and what that kind of means to her in the wake of these accusations. I thought this was a really brave take. I loved that it looked at these ideas and questioned them without taking a side, his side, her side, just looked at the ideas. I do wish that it was longer, but it wasn't incomplete. I just liked it so much that I wanted more of it. I would read it if there was more. And then I read Talking at Night by Claire Daverley. This is about a boy and a girl. They meet as teenagers. The book goes beyond that time frame, and they like each other, they won't talk about it, blah, blah, blah. You know the deal. The boy's very closed off and brooding. He's kind of like a bad boy, and the girl's also pretty reserved and anxious. She has some form of OCD that she's dealing with. I'm all in for a book where nothing happens. I really am, but this just did not do it for me. I had a lot of really small gripes with the book, which I will now tell you about. The girl shares a bed with her brother when they're both teenagers, like full-on cuddles and sleeps in the same bed as her brother. Not out of necessity. They are at home. They both have their own bedrooms. They choose to do this sometimes. And that just kind of, I don't know, it struck me as odd. I don't have a brother, so maybe that's normal. If you have a brother and you do that and you think it's normal, let me know. Maybe, prove me wrong. Go ahead. They also, and this is a pet peeve that I hate when this happens in books and movies and anything. Her and her brother call each other bro and sis. Does anybody do that in real life? Like, actually, do you call your siblings bro and sis? Really? So, back to the girl and the boy that she's actually pursuing, who is her brother's friend. I just did not buy that they were into each other at all. And he's, like, hopelessly devoted to her for a long time while they're not together. Like, he is just pining for her. And I never understood why. They did not get into that. I have no idea why he is obsessing over this random woman. After I read this, I wrote a review on Goodreads, and I wrote that everyone in this book is so bad at communicating their feelings that I genuinely thought this was Irish literature before I started paying attention to the setting. It's set in the UK. And I stand by that. That is true. Everybody in this book is terrible at talking to each other about how they feel. And I thought this was Irish literature. It's not. Another thing that drove me crazy is that so frequently a character would say something that was so, like, dramatic and poetic and, like, just out of character almost. And then whoever they said it to, that character would respond by saying, "Come on, nobody talks like that in real life." That does not excuse the fact that you wrote the crazy line to begin with. You cannot just have another character be like, "Oh, that's crazy. Nobody talks like that." Like, just don't write the craziness. And if that happened once or twice, fine. Okay. It's a book. Like, we can say things that people wouldn't say in real life a couple times. But it happened so many times. I thought I was going crazy. I wish I could read you, like, an example quote, but I got this book from the library, so I don't have a copy of it. Overall, this book was boring, and also the ending sucked. After that, I read They're Going to Love You by Meg Howrey. This was another book that kind of disappointed me a little bit because I just found it kind of boring and slow. It was a good book, but I just really had to trudge through it. It's about a ballerina and her family. I do think the concept is interesting. Her mother and father are also ballerinas. And they're not together because her father is gay, and when she was very young, he left her mother for a man. And he stayed with that same man for the rest of the book and the rest of his life. The daughter, is very close to her father's partner. He's kind of like a mentor to her. He's a very influential figure in her life when she's growing up. The book goes back and forth between her adult life as a professional dancer and her childhood growing up, between her life at home with her mother and her trips to New York to spend time with her father and his partner. It's a good concept. It was just slow and dry and lacked that, like, oomph to keep the book moving forward. Next, I read How Should a Person Be by Sheila Heti. I think this is autobiographical, but Goodreads does describe it as a fictionalized portrait of the artist as a young woman, so maybe some of it is embellished. But it's about Sheila and her kind of journey of self-discovery. She's very focused on how a person should be, like the title says. You know, like, how should a person react in given circumstances? What is the right thing to do? Stuff like that. It also prominently features her best friend Margot, who's a painter, and I really enjoyed the relationship between the two of them. I thought it was a very poignant, accurate portrayal of gaining a female best friend and becoming very close with her when you yourself are not the type to easily attract female friends. Sheila grapples a lot with what it means to be a good friend to Margot. And this book was packed with just so many little nuggets of wisdom that I definitely need to reread it someday to catch some of the ones that I'm sure I missed this first pass through. The book is very stream of consciousness. It reads somewhat like a journal or a diary, and there's not a strong through line for the plot. It's a lot of semi-related anecdotes that follow a general theme, so you'd have to be into that if you're going to enjoy this book. Then I read Housemates by Emma Copley Eisenberg. I was really excited for this. I really was. It's a road trip novel. It's a queer novel. It sounded very promising, but it really dragged on. It's set in Philly, and these two housemates go on a road trip across Pennsylvania to photograph a lot of the more rural areas and document stories from out there. Or at least that's how it's advertised as a road trip novel. This book is like 300 pages, and it took them over 100 pages to even get in the car and start the road trip. And the trip does not last until the end of the book. There is stuff that happens after that. So that's kind of the pace that we're working at. It focused too much on random, unimportant events, and it glossed over the parts that could have actually been the most interesting. So it was not for me. Then I read The Rachel Incident by Caroline O'Donoghue. This is Irish lit. I'm actually surprised there hasn't been more Irish lit on this list than there has already. But it's about a woman named Rachel, obviously, and her roommate, James, who is gay. They met working at a bookstore, and then they very quickly moved in together. Rachel and James get tangled up, kind of romantically, in the lives of one of Rachel's professors and his wife. So the book is Rachel looking back on that time, she's much older now, and telling the story of what happened. This is truly immersive. It's very messy. I really enjoyed the drama between all the characters. And I think if your favorite Sally Rooney novel is Conversations with Friends, you should read this. If there's anything negative that you could say about this book, it would be that it is a book where the main character is a white lady being dramatic about problems that don't actually matter. But that's realistic and relatable to a lot of people, so take that as you will. After that, I read Evenings and Weekends by Ocean McKenna. I read this because Jack in the Books on YouTube recommended it. It takes place over a single weekend, and it has 10 or 15 point of views or something insane like that. Each chapter, we change the character that we're hearing from, and there are just way too many. It's creative, but it's confusing. It's set in London mostly, and it explores the relationship between all of these people. Some of them are related by blood, some of them are romantically involved, some of them are friends, etc. But there's just so many of them. They all have secrets, they all have problems with some of the other people, so it's about that. I think maybe if you're into reality TV where there's a bunch of people who all have confusing opinions about each other, then maybe you would like this, maybe. Then I had another book club book. This was The Pumpkin Spice Cafe by Laurie Gilmore, which has to be a pen name. That can't be her real name. This was actually the same book club that read 50 Shades, so seeing a strange trend there. I did not hate this book, actually. It's extremely cozy and poorly written. It's set in a town called Dream Harbor, and it's about a woman who moves there to take over her aunt's coffee shop, even though she has no experience doing that. And she thinks that the coffee shop is haunted or that somebody's messing with her. And so basically the entire town enlists this guy who is he's a farmer, he's quiet, he's gruff and burly. He is enlisted to help her figure out if the cafe is haunted for whatever reason. And they fall in love. I really liked the small town vibe. I can imagine that this is probably based on Gilmore Girls, but I have not seen it, so I can't confirm. To me, it reminded me a lot of Stardew Valley, if you've played that game, especially because the guy is a farmer, and everybody in the town has a very concrete, tangible, real job. Nobody works in an office. They own a bar, or they own a bookstore, or they work at a coffee shop. The entire book is very predictable and very obvious, but I still had fun reading it. One complaint that I do have is that there is, like, no sex for the first 3/4 of the book, which is fine. But then at the end, it goes crazy, which, I don't know, I don't really like that because I feel like it's very easy. I mean, look at the cover. It would be very easy for a young reader to pick this up and get very far through it thinking that it's appropriate for them. And then at the end, like, out of nowhere, bam, graphic descriptions of sex. I think that's a little bit misleading. After that, I read Blue Sisters by Coco Mellors. This is where I randomly got into a phase of reading books about siblings going through trauma. I don't know how or why, but I read 3 books in a row about that. If you're worried, I do have a sister, and she's fine, as far as I know. This book is about 4 sisters, one of whom passed away a year before the book starts. They were very close growing up, but as adults, they've kind of like scattered to different corners of the world, and they haven't stayed in touch very much. I think that Mellors is truly the master of the multi-perspective novel. She does it very, very well. I don't know about you, but when I'm reading a book that changes perspective and it goes from a character that I like to a character that I don't really care much about, it's always like, ugh. But when Mellors does it, very quickly the new chapter draws me in and it keeps me interested. She's very good at that. I thought that this captured the differences in how birth order of siblings can affect their personalities, and also the specific dynamic between sisters where, like, you know, you love each other, but you are also ruthless and you will come for their throat in a second if you're provoked. The book also deals a lot with addiction and how it runs through families. And if you've read this or you're going to read it, read the acknowledgments. There's a little tidbit in there that makes me think that the book was originally supposed to have a very different, very sad ending. And I can't decide if I would have preferred that or not. I'm curious if other people had the same, like, instinct as me about what that little hint could mean, but I don't want to spoil anything. I think that between this one and her debut novel, Cleopatra and Frankenstein, I preferred this one, but I did still really like Blue Sisters. Also, I'm going to call it now. I think this will be a great TV show when they get around to making it, and they will. Then I read Intermezzo, which is Sally Rooney's newest novel that came out in September of this year. I am a huge Sally Rooney fan, so getting a new one was like Christmas to me. It's about 2 brothers who are very different. They also have a significant age gap, about 10 years between them, and the book starts at their father's funeral. The younger brother, Ivan, is a chess prodigy in his 20s. He's very awkward, he's very uncertain. And then the older brother, Peter, is a lawyer. He's charismatic, he lives a very fast-paced life, and he's very self-assured in a way he, like, always believes that he is right. So the 2 of them have to grapple with their father's death, but also shortly after that happens, Ivan begins seeing a woman who's actually about Peter's age, and Peter has already been seeing a woman who's around Ivan's age. So they're both in relationships where there's about a 10-year age gap or so. And Peter is also very close to his girlfriend from high school, or maybe early college, who was in some kind of accident that left her disabled. I don't want to spoil anything, so I'll just say Peter and Ivan argue a lot. They disagree on a lot of things, and they weren't close to begin with, so their father's death didn't help to bring them together. The book changes perspective between Ivan and Peter, and they are very different styles. Peter is more stream of consciousness and almost fragmented in how fast his thoughts move at times, whereas Ivan's chapters are more slow and methodical in how he thinks and speaks. I loved Ivan's chapters, and I preferred those more than Peter's, definitely. But I'm very curious if other people preferred Peter's and why they did. I absolutely loved this book. I thought it was beautifully written. I loved the descriptions of settings a lot. The last book in my traumatized siblings binge is Shred Sisters by Betsy Lerner. I actually read this because I really enjoy Betsy Lerner's TikToks, where she reads from her journals that she wrote when she was a student at NYU. and she's much older now, so she sometimes is able to like provide insight on how the things that she was worried about back then actually ended up working out. This was her first fiction book, and it came out this October. It's about two sisters, but it's told from the younger sister's point of view the entire time. And the older sister isn't always present as the book goes on. It's less than 300 pages, but it starts when the girls are children, and it actually goes all the way to when they're middle-aged. It spanned like a much longer time frame than I was expecting it to. The older sister, starting from when she's very young, struggles severely with mental health issues, and she's kind of in and out of treatment for her whole life. The younger sister, who the book is about, kind of struggles to grapple with loving this person as her sister, but also realizing that her older sister isn't really a dependable role model figure like you might expect an older sister to be. The older sister kind of becomes MIA once she's older, and then the book focuses primarily on the younger sister's life. As she grows up and gets a job, etc. And there's like brief and unpredictable reappearances by the older sister. I really liked this book. I found it extremely engaging, but it is also very, very sad. So be prepared for that if you're going to read it. Moving on, I read Animals by Emma Jane Unsworth. This is about two girls who are not sisters. They are roommates. One of them is engaged to a famous piano player who travels the world playing music, and the book is told from her perspective. The book is mostly just the girls going out, getting really messed up, and sometimes facing the consequences of that. The girl's fiance is actually very newly sober, and he's kind of struggling with the fact that his partner still lives like this and often, comes over to his place while she's really drunk or high and wants to spend time with him. She's barely even intelligible. And she is struggling with the fact that she got engaged to a man who did things like this, who liked to drink and do drugs with her when they got engaged. But now he's not like that. And she feels very torn between her life with him, which arguably is probably the better path for her, versus her life with her best friend, who wants her to just keep going out and drinking all the time. Sounds interesting, right? Wrong. The book is mostly focused on the girls' nights out together, and they become unintelligible every time, and it happens over and over and over and over. It gets boring. You start wondering what's actually at stake. It was very meandering. The real plot and the conflict of the book, which I thought was life with fiance versus life with friend, gets lost behind these tiny random conflicts, like them arguing with drug dealers and stuff like that. But these tiny random conflicts are hard to even understand because they are being relayed to you by someone who is so drunk that they make no sense. So I think that this idea could have gone somewhere, but the way it was executed, it just didn't keep me that interested. Then I read Drinking, a Love Story by Caroline Knapp, and similar to the last book, this is also about somebody who really enjoys getting drunk. This is an autobiography of Knapp's real-life struggle with alcoholism and trying to get sober. She writes about her life when she was drinking and all of the things that she did that may not make sense to somebody who's not an alcoholic, like hiding booze at her boyfriend's house so that she could drink it later, or she sees two guys at once for years, even though she wants a monogamous relationship. So just talking a lot about how booze was completely destroying her life. She also discusses a lot of the different things that she did to try and get sober. She tried AA, she did inpatient treatment at a rehab center, she was in therapy for most of her life. I did think the book was insightful, and it can really show you a window into the mind of somebody who's struggling with the disease of alcoholism. And it's set in New England, in the Boston area, so it got bonus points for that, to me. One sad note about this is I finished the book, and then it had an about the author at the end, and I saw that she stayed sober for the rest of her life. She fought really hard to get sober, I think in her 30s, maybe early 40s. And then soon after, she passed away from lung cancer. So, if you're listening, sorry that you put all that effort in just to die from smoking cigarettes. That is unfortunate. Then I read Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. This book is so popular, and I was pretty excited to read it because I know that so many people love it, and I've also heard a lot of people say that it made them cry. And if you can't tell already, I love a sad book. It's about Sadie and Sam, who meet as kids in a hospital, and they bond over video games. They reconnect later in college, and they decide to actually make games together with the help of Sam's roommate, who kind of manages them. Their video games that they make actually end up becoming really successful, and the book is about how the relationship between the three of them changes over time as their company gets bigger and bigger. And I really didn't like this as much as I was hoping that I would. I had a couple major problems with it. For one, it definitely suffers from thesaurus overuse at times. The general book overall, down to the individual sentences, is written pretty simply, almost to a YA level, but then randomly, out of nowhere, there will be a word that no one uses at all in real life, and it just seems completely out of place. Also, there's a lot of very sad events that happen over the course of the book. It kind of actually reminded me of A Little Life in that way. But whereas A Little Life drew me in because I wanted to know what happened that made Jude the way that he is, this book, it was like the sad events kind of came out of nowhere, and it happened so many times without warning that they kind of lost their weight. And the use of the sad circumstances to draw the reader in gets overused, and it loses its ability to be like a riveting plot point that moves the story forward and keeps the reader interested. Something that I did like about this book, though, is part of it is written actually inside of one of the video games that they made, and I thought that was very creative. But overall, this was just meh for me, and it definitely did not make me cry. Then I read another short story collection called Interpreter of Maladies by Gilbert. Some of these are set in India, and then some of them are set in America with either Indian or Indian American characters. A friend recommended this to me, and as I was reading it, I actually realized that I have read some of the stories before, I think in school. But anyways, there's a really good variety of stories in here, and I think that Lahiri is very creative with the perspective that some of the stories are told from. Like, there was one, I think it was the last story, or maybe the second to last, about a woman in India who lives with her uncle and her aunt in a building with lots of other people who are all kind of friendly with each other. And she has a mystery illness that no doctor has ever really been able to help with, but the story is told from the perspective of all of the women who live in the building, like as a collective. It's narrated as, we saw this and that, and this happened to her. And I think that really made the reader like feel a part of this collective that's somewhat responsible for the character's well-being. And that's just one example. All of these stories are very different, and I always love a short story collection as like a palate cleanser between books, or if you're in a reading slump or anything like that. I think they're great. Then I read Jillian by Hallie Butler. This is the first Hallie Butler novel that I read. I also got it as a recommendation from Uncarly's channel. It's about two coworkers. One of them is in her 20s. She is deeply depressed, very critical and negative. The other one is in her 30s, and she is optimistic to a delusional degree, and she's a single mom. The two of them run the front desk of a doctor's office. The younger one hates the older one, like actually cannot stand her, and then the older one doesn't really realize at all, and she's always just trying to be friendly and positive at work. And the book goes back and forth between their perspectives, but it shows a lot of their home lives as well, maybe even more so than their work lives. And then as the book goes on, both of their lives basically just fall to shambles. They're each ruining their own lives very quickly. And I really did like this book, but just as they get to a point where you're like, oh my god, how are either of them ever going to recover from these disasters that they've gotten themselves into? The book ends. So I wish it was longer so that we could see these problems be resolved, but I did enjoy it, so I don't know. After that, I read The Girls by Emma Cline. This is about a girl who accidentally joins a cult, and the cult ends up murdering some people. That's not a spoiler, you get told very early on, but she happened to not be there the night of the murders, so she didn't get like arrested or jailed for the rest of her life or anything. Now she's a mostly normal adult woman, and this is her reflecting on that time in her life and how she was able to be influenced into taking part in the cult in the first place. I really liked it. I thought it was interesting to see what events in her life before she joined made her kind of like a loner, looking for community and belonging, and left her very susceptible to joining a cult. Also, without spoiling anything, the book gets a little bit queer. So it's not all about these girls all sleeping with the guy who runs the cult. There's some other things hinted at as well. I liked the girls so much that I was like, you know what? Let me jump straight into another Emma Cline book. And then I read The Guest. This one is about a woman. It seems like she used to be a prostitute, but she began dating a very wealthy man who didn't know that she was a prostitute. And he invites her to move in with him on Long Island for the summer, which was great for her because she was simultaneously getting evicted from her own apartment. Unfortunately, he kicks her out, and she doesn't want to admit to him that she's essentially homeless. So she decides, you know what? I'm just gonna grift around Long Island trying to stay with strangers for a week, and then maybe he'll be over it and be willing to take me back and I can move back in. But from then on, she's a hot mess, as you can imagine. She has zero morals, and she spends the entire week doing terrible things just to try to find a place to stay. I didn't hate it, but it got kind of repetitive, her trying to look for a place to stay each night. And also the ending where she goes back to him after the week is up. It's pretty obvious what happens, whether or not he takes her back, you can tell in that moment. But the book ends without actually seeing it play out. So I thought that was kind of unsatisfying. Those are all the books that I read in 2024. I wanted to read 40, but I got through 36, and to me that's still a good amount. If you watched all of this, I'm honestly surprised. This is the first video that I've ever made about books, so if you enjoyed it, let me know. I would love to make more. I love talking about books. All right, thanks. Bye.